everyone knows how the story ends. March 15th, 44 BC, the Ides of March. 23 stab wounds, a great man cut down in a storm of betrayal, his lifeblood staining the marble at the feet of his rival's statue. We see the paintings, we read the plays. We think we know the story of the assassination of Julius Caesar. But what if I told you that story is a lie? Not a lie, in the sense that it didn't happen. Oh, it happened. But it wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the end. It wasn't the cause of the Roman Empire. It was the consequence. The real story, the one that truly explains how a republic died and an empire was born, happened more than 20 years earlier. It was a plot so audacious, so terrifyingly ambitious, it makes the Ides of March look like a back alley brawl. A plot to murder not just one man, but dozens. To burn the Senate to the ground, to unleash foreign soldiers on the streets of Rome, and to install a dictator in the ensuing chaos. And at the center of it all, long before he was a godlike figure, was a surprisingly young, dangerously charismatic politician named Gaius Julius Caesar. He was a target, and the story of how he survived this first assassination plot is the secret key to understanding everything that came after. This is the story of the scar that forged an emperor. What you're about to hear is a story of shadowy deals, immense wealth, and a conspiracy that was deliberately erased from the history books. We're going to uncover the anatomy of a coup, the ghost of a conspiracy, and the ultimate terrifying irony that the men who tried to kill Caesar to save the Republic were the very ones who guaranteed its destruction. This is the story you were never meant to know. And if you're ready to dive into more shocking historical secrets that textbooks won't tell you, hit that subscribe button because we're just getting started. 1. The Viper's Nest. To understand the plot, you first have to understand the city. This wasn't the Rome of emperors and legions you see in the movies. This was a city on the verge of a nervous breakdown. The Roman Republic in 65 BC was a pressure cooker, and the lid was about to blow. Imagine a world with no police force, no safety net, and a government run by a handful of fabulously wealthy families who saw politics not as public service, but as a blood sport. The gap between the super rich and the desperately poor was a chasm. Millions were drowning in debt, losing their farms to predatory lenders, and flooding into the city, creating a desperate, angry mob that could be bought by the highest bidder. This is the part you don't learn in history class. The Republic wasn't a noble democracy. It was a chaotic oligarchy, teetering on the brink of collapse, held together by brittle traditions and the ever-present threat of violence. And into this viper's nest walked our players. First, you have the old guard, the optimates. These were the establishment conservatives, men who believed the Senate, and by extension their own ancient families, should hold all the power. They looked at the chaos in the streets and saw a threat to their way of life. They were led by figures like Cato the Younger, a man so rigidly traditional he was practically a walking statue. To them, any change was a threat, and any popular new politician was a potential tyrant. Then you had the populares, the people's men. They weren't necessarily saints. They were just politicians who understood that the path to power lay in winning over the angry, indebted masses. They proposed land reforms, debt relief, and public works. The optimates called this pandering. The people called it hope. And in 65 BC, the most electrifying of these populares was a 35-year-old man named Julius Caesar. Forget the Caesar you think you know. This wasn't the conqueror of Gaul yet. This wasn't the dictator for life. In 65 BC, he held the office of aedile, essentially the commissioner of public works and games. A mid-level position, but one he used with breathtaking genius. While other aediles put on a few gladiatorial fights, Caesar staged spectacles that were the stuff of legend. He flooded the Circus Maximus for mock naval battles. He equipped hundreds of gladiators in gleaming silver armor, dazzling a city starved for entertainment. He was borrowing money on a scale that was insane, sinking himself into a black hole of debt. His enemies laughed. They thought he was a reckless, bankrupt playboy, but they missed the point. Every denarius he spent was an investment in the love of the people. And it was working. The common folk adored him. He spoke their language. He understood their struggles. But here's where it gets dangerous. Caesar didn't just have charm, he had a legacy. He was the nephew of Gaius Marius, a legendary general and a hero of the Populares, who had fought a brutal civil war against the Optimates' champion Sulla. Sulla had won, slaughtering thousands of his political opponents and posting lists of the proscribed, death sentences with rewards attached. As a teenager, Caesar had been on that list. He had been hunted. He only survived because powerful friends intervened, with Sulla allegedly saying, "In this one boy I see many Mariuses." It was a prophecy, and in 65 BC, Caesar made a move that sent a shockwave through the establishment. As aedile, he restored the public monuments and trophies of his uncle Marius, which Sulla had torn down. To the Optimates, this was a declaration of war. It was like putting up a statue of Lenin in the heart of the Pentagon during the Cold War. It was a direct challenge to their entire world order. They saw that quote from Sulla coming true. They saw a new Marius, a man who could command the mob, a man who wasn't afraid. And they decided he had to be stopped, not at the ballot box, but with a blade. But they couldn't do it alone. For a plot this big, they needed backing, they needed power, they needed money. And in Rome, money had one name: Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus was the richest man in Roman history. He made his fortune during Sulla's proscriptions, buying up the property of the condemned for pennies on the dollar. He owned vast tracts of the city and ran Rome's only fire brigade, a private company that would arrive at a burning building and negotiate a price to put out the fire while the owner watched their home turn to ash. He was endlessly wealthy, but what he craved was political power and military glory to match his great rival, Pompey the Great. So, here we have our stage, a city ready to explode, a rising star in Caesar who is terrifying the establishment, and a billionaire puppet master in Crassus looking for an opportunity. The vipers were in the nest. The air was thick with conspiracy. All they needed was a plan. 2. The anatomy of a coup. The plan was brutal, simple, and utterly terrifying. Historians call it the first Catilinarian conspiracy, but the details are murky, whispered in the letters of Cicero and the biographies of Suetonius. This is deliberate. The powerful are very good at erasing their mistakes, but by piecing together the fragments, the shape of the monster becomes clear. The plot was scheduled for the first day of the year, January 1st. On that day, the two newly elected consuls, the highest officials in the Republic, would be taking their oaths of office. The plan was for the conspirators, led by a senator named Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso, to storm the forum, assassinate both new consuls on the spot, and declare themselves the new leaders of Rome. But this wasn't just about replacing two men. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. The plot allegedly involved a widespread massacre of leading Optimate senators. A hit list had been drawn up. The goal was to decapitate the conservative faction in one swift, bloody stroke. It was Sulla's proscriptions turned back on his own party. And who would lead this new government? The sources point to two men. The new consul would be an ally of the conspirators, and the power behind the throne, the man with the real authority, the office of dictator, would go to Marcus Crassus. And Caesar, what was his role? The sources name him as a key player. He was allegedly meant to be in charge of the aftermath. While Crassus and the assassins secured the political power, Caesar, with his popularity, was meant to go to the people, to calm the mob, to sell the coup as a necessary evil to save the Republic from corrupt elites. He was to be the public face of the revolution. It was a perfect plan. It used Crassus's money, the assassins' ruthlessness, and Caesar's popularity. But they needed muscle. They needed soldiers who would follow orders without question, who wouldn't be swayed by loyalty to the Republic. And this is the part that would have horrified any true Roman. They planned to use foreign mercenaries. Piso, one of the ringleaders, was being given a commission to govern Spain. The plan was to raise an army there. And even more shockingly, another plotter, Publius Sittius, had an army waiting in North Africa, and there were whispers of recruiting Gallic tribesmen from the north. They were going to use foreign swords to settle a Roman political dispute. It was the ultimate betrayal. Think about the sheer audacity of this. This wasn't a few angry men with knives like the Ides of March. This was a coordinated military and political coup backed by unlimited funds and foreign troops. They weren't just trying to kill Caesar. Caesar was one of them, a key player in a plot to kill the entire government. Or so the story goes. The day came. January 1st, 65 BC. The city held its breath. The conspirators were in place. The assassins were ready. And then nothing happened. The signal was never given. The sources disagree on why. Some say Crassus got cold feet and failed to show up. Others say the plot was discovered, and the consuls were surrounded by so many bodyguards that an attack was impossible. The coup failed before it even began. They rescheduled. A month later, early February. This time, the plan was even more desperate. They wouldn't just attack the consuls, they would attack the entire Senate while it was in session. But once again, something went wrong. The main plotter, Catiline, supposedly gave the signal for the attack too early before all the armed men had gathered. He stood before the Senate House, a knot of nervous killers behind him, but the full force wasn't there. They hesitated. The moment was lost. The plot had failed again. Twice, they had stood on the precipice of revolution. Twice, they had stepped back from the edge. The plot dissolved. The assassins melted back into the shadows. And the city of Rome unknowingly breathed a sigh of relief. But you can't plan a civil war and leave no trace. People had talked. Rumors had spread. The conspiracy was an open secret. So why was there no investigation? Why were there no arrests, no trials, no executions? The answer is the most chilling part of the entire story. 3. The ghost of a conspiracy. The plot had failed. The coup was a fiasco. In a healthy republic, the aftermath would have been swift and brutal. The conspirators would have been dragged before the Senate, tried for treason, and executed. But the Roman Republic in 65 BC was far from healthy. It was septic. This is the part of the story that feels unnervingly modern. What happened next was not a reckoning. It was a cover-up. Think about the men involved. Crassus, the richest man in the world. Caesar, the city's most popular politician. Other powerful senators and influential figures. To prosecute them would be to admit that the entire system was rotten to the core. It would trigger the very civil war they had just narrowly avoided. The Optimate establishment, the supposed victims of the plot, were faced with a terrible choice. Expose the rot and destroy the house, or paper over the cracks and pretend the foundations were still sound. They chose to pretend. There was no official investigation, no grand trial. The key players simply went on with their lives. Crassus went back to counting his money. Piso was quietly sent off to his governorship in Spain, a move many suspected was just to get him out of the city. He was later murdered there by his own local troops, an end shrouded in suspicion. Was he silenced? We'll never know. And Caesar, he didn't just walk free, he thrived. Later that year, he presided over a court for murder. The irony is staggering. A man accused of plotting a political massacre was now sitting in judgment of common criminals. He acted as if nothing had happened, with a combination of arrogance and charm that was becoming his trademark. The conspiracy was allowed to become a ghost, a rumor, a what if. It was never proven. It was never disproven. It just hung in the air, a toxic fog of suspicion that poisoned everything. And this had a profound effect on everyone involved, especially Caesar. He had stared into the abyss. He had played the game of shadows and daggers and had by sheer luck survived. What lessons do you think he learned from this? He learned that the Republic's traditions were a joke. Its laws were meaningless in the face of power and wealth. His enemies would stop at nothing to destroy him, and his supposed allies, like Crassus, were unreliable and would abandon him at the first sign of trouble. He learned that in this world, you were either the predator or the prey. There was no middle ground. He learned that the only person he could truly rely on was himself. The only real power was absolute power. The only way to be safe was to be in charge. The worst part was the cover-up didn't make the problem go away. It festered. 2 years later, the same plotter, Catiline, would try again, this time with a full-blown populist uprising known as the Second Catilinarian Conspiracy. This time, the plot was brutally exposed and crushed by the consul Cicero. During the debate in the Senate about what to do with the captured conspirators, most senators were baying for their immediate, illegal execution. Only one man stood up and argued for the rule of law, for a fair trial. That man was Julius Caesar. His enemies immediately accused him of being part of this new plot as well, claiming he was trying to save his fellow conspirators. Cato the Younger gave a fiery speech, all but calling Caesar a traitor. The mood in the Senate turned ugly. Senators began to draw their swords. Caesar's life was once again in danger, right there on the Senate floor. He was only saved when his bodyguards rushed him out of the building. The experience of 65 BC was the fire that hardened the steel. The ghost of that first conspiracy haunted him. It showed him the truth of his world, and it put him on a path from which there was no return, the path to the Rubicon, the path to dictatorship, the path to the Ides of March. The climax, the scar that forged an emperor. Everything we associate with the great Julius Caesar, the unstoppable general, the political genius, the man who dismantled a 500-year-old republic, was born in the crucible of this forgotten plot. This is the ultimate reveal, the secret that reframes the entire story. The brush with death in 65 BC left a scar on Caesar's political soul. It taught him the defining lesson of his life. The system was rigged. The elites who preached about tradition and the rule of law would discard it in a second to protect their own power. They tried to murder him in the shadows, and when that failed, they tried to smear him into oblivion. From that moment on, Caesar played by a new set of rules, his own. When he went to Gaul, he didn't just command an army, he forged a private one, loyal only to him. Why? Because the ghost of the conspiracy taught him that a politician without an army was a victim waiting to happen. When the Senate ordered him to disband that army and return to Rome as a private citizen to face certain prosecution and probable assassination, he refused. He crossed the Rubicon River, the legal boundary of his province, and triggered a civil war. It was an act of treason, but in his mind, it was an act of self-preservation, a lesson learned 20 years prior. He had seen the face of the Republic in that dark room in 65 BC. He knew it was a lie. He knew the vipers in the Senate would never accept him. So he decided to burn the nest down. His entire career from that point on was a preemptive strike against the enemies he knew were perpetually waiting in the shadows. The man who died on the Ides of March in 44 BC was not the same man who had put on silver-armored gladiators in 65 BC. That younger man may have believed in the Republic, may have believed he could reform it from within. But the man the assassins killed was someone else entirely. He was a man who had been radicalized by their own hatred, hardened by their own conspiracies. He had become a dictator because they had shown him that any other position was a death sentence. The assassins on the Ides of March thought they were killing a tyrant to save the Republic. They never understood they were merely finishing a job their own class had started 21 years earlier. They were killing the man they themselves had created. The powerful summary and thematic irony. We remember the death of Caesar, but we've forgotten the events that created him. We focus on the bloody finale, but the real story lies in the ghost of that first failed conspiracy. It reveals a truth far more disturbing than a simple assassination. The Roman Republic was already dead long before Caesar was. It had become a hollow shell, a playground for corrupt oligarchs and violent plotters, where the rule of law was merely a suggestion. And here we find the grand, tragic irony of it all. The very senators who schemed and plotted against a young popular politician out of fear that he might one day seize absolute power by their very actions set him on the exact path they dreaded. Their paranoia became a self-fulfilling prophecy. In their attempt to preemptively destroy a potential king, they created an actual emperor. They hated Caesar for being a threat to the Republic, while failing to see that the greatest threat was their own hypocrisy and violence. This isn't just a story about ancient Rome. It's a timeless story about power, paranoia, and the fragility of democracy. It's a warning about what happens when political norms break down, when fear replaces debate, and when a system becomes so corrupt that it begins to devour itself. The story of Caesar's first, forgotten assassination plot is the story of how a nation and a man can be pushed past the point of no return. The interactive call to action. The shadows of history are filled with stories like this, pivotal moments and secret conspiracies that are far more important than the headlines we all know. The official story is rarely the whole story. If these dark corners of history fascinate you, hit that like button, subscribe for more shocking historical secrets, and tell me in the comments what other historical mysteries I should investigate next.